Some of the views in New Zealand are definitely worth the hike to get there, and Lake Matheson is certainly no exception. It's 5 a.m. We got up at 3:30 a.m. so that we could drive to this spot at Lake Matheson, a very cherished location on the South Island where you can see the Southern Alps and you can see Fox Glacier in the shot. We're here at sunrise because at sunrise, the light actually comes from behind the mountains, and if it's a nice morning, it'll start to illuminate the mountaintops, and it'll also start to cast beautiful light on the fog on the lake and also the trees and everything surrounding this area. So it's a very beautiful area. The other reason that we got here early, sunrise is actually around 6:45, but we wanted to make sure that we were here before everybody else gets here. It's a very popular location, and when sunrise comes up, a lot of people visit just to be here for the spectacle of light that happens. So we wanted to make sure that we have the nice viewing area, the good platform spot, that we can make sure we can take advantage of the shot and get exactly what we want. I'd never been to this location before, so we decided to come out here and scout out what a sunset would look like. It's about a 2.5-kilometer hike into this location. So we set up and we wanted to see the mountains and we wanted to see what the shot was going to look like, but it was completely cloudy. It was to the point where we couldn't see any of the mountains over there. It was just a flat landscape and very boring. So we were hoping that everything cleared up. So this morning I decided to wake up a little bit early. I actually got up at 3:30 a.m. and I went outside and I looked up and it was mixed. I had some clouds and some stars, which is exactly what I was hoping for. The problem is, once we got set up in this location, I noticed that more thick clouds moved in. So it actually looks very similar this morning as it did last night. The problem is it looked perfect when we left at around 4, but by the time we got set up here, I think the clouds just started to accumulate. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen here. It kind of looks similar to the sunset, and what I'm hoping is that as the sun starts to come up, it breaks through those clouds. But considering the clouds have been thickening this whole time we've been here, it's not looking so good. Take a look at this reference photo. Yesterday was so bad that we couldn't even see the mountain tips, so there was no sun to even illuminate those mountain tips, and even if there was, there'd be nothing to illuminate. The other thing that was a problem is there was a little bit of wind, so it was not even a reflection shot. So there was no reflection, no mountains, and no light. So the shot wasn't going to work at all, even though it did have potential. Even though it doesn't look too promising today, I'm going to stay here anyway. I'm going to shoot all the way through the sunrise, hoping that that sun decides to burn some of the cloud layer away. I'm not very positive that that's going to happen, but I always like to stay here anyway, just in case. I've been waiting through the morning. The sun is about to come up and the conditions have gotten even worse. Where there was some texture in the sky before, it's kind of turned into this hazy overcast. And this is one of those shots where I'm really working on an iconic mountainscape. So this is a ridgeline that people know and they cherish, and right now you can't even see it. You can barely see above the trees. So I'm 100% confident that this shot is not going to work today. The other thing that's happening is it looks like rain clouds are starting to accumulate above us. We have a 45-minute hike back to the car, so the last thing we want to do is get caught in the rain with all this gear. So since I'm 100% confident the shot is not going to work, we're going to pack it all up, go back to the car, get some rest, get up again tomorrow at 3:30 a.m. and try this all over again. It's always disappointing when early wake-up calls result in failure, but that's why we're going to try again for another attempt. 3:30 a.m. wake-up call number 2, and now I have the complete opposite thing happening. There are no clouds in the sky. In fact, we've set up here early at the same time to beat the crowds, and with these reference photos that I've been taking to get my positioning, I can see the stars and the moon rising. It's crystal clear out. As you can see, yesterday it was completely cloudy, have that crazy glowy effect from the moon and then the low sunlight, but today it's crystal clear. We can still see the moonlight, but we have all the stars, perfect reflection, and those beautiful mountains in the background. So here's what I'm hoping for. As the day starts to progress and that sun comes up, what I'm hoping is that it starts to illuminate all of the tree line on the right, as well as this beautiful lake fog that's been rolling across. So if everything goes as planned, there's going to be a lot of beautiful, varied light in this entire scene. We've set up again very early this morning, so there's still quite a bit of time before the sun actually comes up. So I'm going to figure out if I like a wide shot or a zoom shot better. I'm going to take different reference photos to show you guys what I settled on. And then once I settle on the composition, I'm going to wait for the lighting to happen. Been out here for a while now, and everything's starting to look really good. As you can see from this reference image, the light is just starting to illuminate the mountains fully, and it's starting to cast some light on the fog and the tree line. Compositionally, this shot by nature is very simple. It's a flat, mirrored reflection. Now, we're really lucky today there's no wind, so we see a perfect reflection, almost like we mirrored it ourselves in Photoshop. So I want to take full advantage of that beautiful reflection, and instead of offsetting the horizon line, I'm going to keep it dead center so it looks like a perfect mirror. Now, generally in landscape photography, you don't want your horizon to be in the center. You want to use the rule of thirds or anything just to offset it a little bit. But because the mirror effect is so perfect and so symmetrical, I want to take full advantage of that to really highlight it. So here's a wide shot with the centered horizon that I was talking about. Now, while it looks pretty cool, there is zero detail in the sky. If there were beautiful clouds right now, it might work really well because we'd get the opposing clouds in the mirrored reflection. But since they're not there, there's nothing in the sky, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the composition a little bit so I can focus in on all those lighting details, the lighting on the trees, the lighting on the fog, and the lighting on the mountains. That becomes the most important element of this image because the sky is completely void. Speaking specifically about this particular composition, there really is no variation in my positioning. I cannot move to the left or the right, and the scene stays completely static and an infinite plane. So it's all about cropping. All I can really do is zoom in a little bit, zoom out, or move to the left or the right to just offset the shot a little bit. Now, I've chosen to move my camera a little bit to the right because we have this wrap effect from the trees wrapping around the side of the lake, so they go back in perspective and create this really nice compositional V leading line all the way into the mountain ridge. Now, remember from the wide shot, we had these weird trees on the left that actually came up in a cone shape and reflected. I wasn't really happy about that. I felt like it broke the continuity of that leading line. So when I zoomed in, I took advantage of the right side of all of those trees leading the eye into the mountain range, but I still used those strange trees on the left as a framing element. So you can see I have the darker color of those trees on the left, but I don't see that they're a strange shape or that they end. It actually looks like they continue outside of the frame. This is also kind of cool because usually I'm waiting for a crucial moment that's before the sunrise when we get all that color in the clouds and all that color in the sky. But this has actually happened about 20 minutes after sunrise. The sun is up high enough to start illuminating all of these different elements. Now, I've caught it at what I think is the perfect moment when it's just started to hit those trees. Well, basically, there are a few extra things we can take away from this lesson. One is to always pre-scout locations, especially when they require driving and hiking. Even though we couldn't see the mountains when we hiked in here and scouted, we could still check out the spot and we knew exactly how long it took to get here. That's really important because we also knew how early we had to wake up. So we had to actually wake up at 3:30, which did kind of suck, but that gave us plenty of time to get here in the spot ahead of everybody else. So that's really important. If we hadn't scouted, honestly, I probably wouldn't have left that early and we would have arrived way too late. Another good takeaway from this lesson is while we're usually moving the horizon line up or down to create a more interesting composition, when we're dealing with perfect mirrors, it's actually perfectly okay to center that line. And honestly, I like to do it a lot because it accentuates that beautiful, perfect mirror effect. Another thing to keep in mind is while a sunset here could be equally as beautiful but in a different way, you have a better chance of having calm with no wind conditions in the morning. Now, this is not a universal rule, but it's a general percentage rule. Most of the shots where I've had the crystal clear, perfect still water have been early AM shots. Usually when you come out in the afternoon, there's either a little bit of wind that happens here, or maybe even there's boats that have been going by, people canoeing that have created disturbance in the water. So if you're really looking for a perfect, crystal clear, flat mirrored reflection, definitely try to come in the morning. This was a really nice lighting event, a really beautiful morning, so I probably overshot a little bit because I was a little bit excited about it. So I have a few different compositions to look at on the big screen. After I select my favorite one, I'm going to take it into post-processing and really make it shine. Welcome back to the post-processing studio. This is lesson 12, Lake Matheson in New Zealand. Remember from the video portion of this was a really beautiful reflection shot, very simple shot, and it took us quite a few attempts to be able to get the shot that we wanted. If you've watched the behind-the-scenes episode of this, you know that it wasn't the easiest thing to wake up early. I was fine with it, but if you haven't watched the behind-the-scenes yet, it would be good to see Lee's reaction to having to make too many 4 a.m. wake-up calls. Nevertheless, we were able to get the shot that we wanted, and this is the type of the shot, you know, it's not too complicated, it's very beautiful, straight out of camera, very simple, and it's that simplicity that makes it very beautiful and really makes that mountainscape really come alive. So there's really not going to be a lot of post-processing here, but I want to take this opportunity to transition our software a little bit. So before we've been using Adobe Lightroom, and Adobe Lightroom, as we know, is really great. We've learned some pretty cool tools in there, ways to push the camera raw. What we're going to do now is we're going to be switching to Capture One and showing the equivalent tools, comparing it to Lightroom for the color and the texture, the way that it really is able to bring back these colors. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is look at an example. Next thing we're going to do is get this into Photoshop, and since the sky was blue, we've already done a sky replacement, but in this case, I don't want to do a full replacement. All I really want to do is add some texture to the sky, just so it doesn't make it seem like it was a blue sky, so it had a little bit of the texture of the cloud. So that's something we're going to do in the Channels palette once we get into Photoshop. Let's begin. First thing here that I have open is the scene from Lake Matheson that I chose. Remember, we went through some different compositions here, but this is the one that I liked the most. So the first thing I want to do is show you guys what it looks like inside of Adobe Lightroom. Remember back to the Church of the Good Shepherd, that telephoto shot. Remember when I showed the different versions, how we could get those colors to pop? Right now it's a very beautiful scene, great fog, a little bit of floating cloud here, beautiful light on the trees, but again, Lightroom processes things, keeps things just a little bit flat. We're not going to get too much into the Lightroom, but I want to show you again, this is a good candidate for changing the camera calibration. So instead of the default camera flat, we may be able to go to camera neutral and pump those colors up a little bit. So that's going to expand the contrast and bring some of that color tonality that we lost in the initial processing of Lightroom. But instead of doing this in Lightroom, as I said, I wanted to use Capture One. So let's take a look at Capture One. Capture One is the second raw processor that I use. So basically, I'm 50-50 with my files. Some I feel that Lightroom does a really good job. Some I feel that Capture One does a really good job. But where Capture One really excels is color rendition. So if your files turn to be a little flat inside of Lightroom, Capture One may be the answer to really pop out the vibrancy of the colors. And this is what it looks like by default, straight out of camera. You can see the difference. When we were in Lightroom, the colors didn't pop quite as much as they do now in Capture One. Now, Capture One looks completely different. As you can see, it's a completely different interface. So let's kind of go through it. Now, I've already imported this. If you guys want to open up this file, you can find it in that folder. You'll see a folder called Capture One Files. In there is a catalog file that you can open, and you can look at this yourself and make these adjustments. So right now, there's a few tabs here. Folder tab here on the left allows me to import and manage all of the images that I have, all the images that I want in my collection. The next thing is this color. The three colors here allow me to change the Kelvin temperature, custom white balance, and set some of the import on the color. So if I wanted to warm it up, cool it down, or change the tint. We're going to be spending most of our time here editing the same information that we were doing in Adobe Lightroom, but we're going to be editing it now in a different way. So we've been talking about raw recovery. You can see now we have exposure, contrast, brightness, saturation, highlight, and shadow. Now, highlight and shadow fall under this high dynamic range menu. So they've kind of done this throwback to increasing the dynamic range of your image by using the term high dynamic range. But it's really nice. So this takes the place of highlight and shadow recovery. Simply by sliding this to the right, we'll actually start to recover those highlights in the sky. And you can see the curve change to reflect that result. So most of our recovery in the RAW is going to be done in this high dynamic range menu. It's actually simplified the process, left the color corrections, the contrast selections on the top, and then the recovery here in this second area. Next thing that we can do is we can change the shadows, highlights, and midtones either here in the levels or here in the curves. We've been using the curves a little bit, so you should understand basically how to change the midtones, the highlights, or the shadows. I actually like to use the levels. I'm going to show you guys how. If I wanted to change the position of the highlights, I could grab the top of this. And you can see as I drag to the left, it's going to change the curve. It's going to clamp those. So if areas are blown out, I can move this to the left and start to clamp it. So it's not quite as intuitive as far as a slider-based environment like Lightroom is, for example, but you can still do all of the same things that you can inside of Lightroom, just with some different tools. So it's just important to know that everything's basically the same, it's just called something different and it functions in a little bit different of a way. So let's get right down to editing. And as I said, these are the basic things we're going to stay in right here. But before we get to editing, it might be a good idea to show you guys a little bit more of the options that we can do here. So we have here under the magnifying glass, this is details. Now remember, inside of Adobe Lightroom, I told you that I always turn off the sharpening. Inside of Capture One, I like to leave it by default. So where Lightroom fails on its global sharpening, Capture One does this really great job of sharpening the raw file and removing some of the noise around that sharpening by default. If you don't want to use it, you can turn all this to 0 just to make sure that you're not using any of the built-in tools inside of Capture One. I can tell you by personal experience that it does a fantastic job, and it's actually changed my workflow on sharpening a little bit. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the upcoming lessons. From now on, we'll be using Capture One in a raw editing workflow. Let's talk about this file specifically now. Again, we looked at many different compositions, but this one was my favorite. You can see that the trees all the way from the right kind of slope down across the frame, and then this dark set of trees here kind of frame the beautiful southern Alps of New Zealand. It's a really nice scene. Already has a lot of great contrast. You can see it's a little blown out in this area of the sky, so we're going to have to address that. And I'd like some more vibrancy in the colors. But this is one of those scenes, it was so serene, so beautiful, that I want to minimally process it. But let's just go ahead and first correct the things, just like we would in Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to use the highlight slider here, though, in the high dynamic range menu, and I'm going to start to bring back those highlights, just so I can get those mountain tips back a little bit. So I'm going to drag this up just a little bit. That looks pretty good. And I'm also going to recover the shadows. So here on the left, I kind of like that it is very dark, but I want to have that control in Photoshop. I want to make sure that I don't limit myself before I go into Photoshop, so I'm just going to increase the shadows. And you can see as I start to roll to the right too much, if I roll too much, I get this, this other set of shrubbery here. The reflection's a little bit gray. Not too happy with it. So let's just do a little bit. And you can see that my tone curve is going to change, and now I'm not blowing anything out. So that looks pretty good so far. Now again, very simple scene. We're going to do a little bit more in Photoshop. Before I do that though, I want to point one more thing out. Another thing that I said about Adobe Lightroom is don't use the clarity slider. It's not very good. I know that I kind of do get on Adobe's case for that clarity slider not doing a very good job with clarity. On the other hand, clarity inside of this program in Capture One does a much better job of actually creating more details in your image. So if you're still not satisfied with the punch before you go into Photoshop, you can change the clarity here. So just by changing it, you can see that it actually is changing the contrast. If I take the clarity all the way up, you can see that we're starting to get some halos, but it's still doing kind of a cool thing to the image. So if you want to just add a little bit extra here, sometimes I take it up to 5 or 10 before I go into Photoshop. The structure is pretty cool. Structure is sort of a global sharpening pass. The more you change structure, the more it's going to try to pop your edges. I generally leave this alone or leave it at 0. With these basic corrections now, let's go ahead and get this into Photoshop. Now, since I use different raw editors all the time, sometimes I use Lightroom and Capture One combined, I like to use the same workflow of exporting the file and then opening it back into Photoshop. So I'm going to right-click, say Export, Variants. So when this menu comes up, you can see that I'm exporting as a PSD, a Pro Photo, 300 pixels, and the scale is going to be fixed at 100%. And then a post-action to open in Photoshop CC. As I told you, I'd recommend working in 16-bit, but you can also work in 8-bit. We've been working with 8-bit throughout this tutorial because it's half the file size. It allows me to open, make edits, and change things without lagging the computer. But for this file, I can go ahead and leave it as 16-bit because it is pretty simple. When I click Export, it's going to export the file into my temp directory and then automatically open it in Photoshop, just like we did from Lightroom. The next step before we add texture to the sky is to go in and zap out some of those pesky dust spots and sensor dust spots that I've been showing you guys in these files. So again, apologies for that, but we have to take care of those first before we start any compositing. So I'm going to use the heel brush tool just like we've been doing before. There may have been some bugs floating around in this water, just a few different things, and I want to make sure that we go ahead and clean it up now so it doesn't come back to haunt us later. Really, I like to do it before I start applying any heavy effects because the more effects we have on these objects, especially the sky here, the more that these spots are going to be pronounced. So we'll just change them a little bit. Again, not too difficult with the spot healing brush. Really simple process of just going out and seeking them in. And here you can see there's even one here in the mountainscape, so we want to get rid of that one. Want to make sure there's nothing in these details that's going to give away any imperfections that we had on the camera sensor. That looks pretty good. Zoom all the way out. And now let's talk a little bit about what we could potentially do with this file. Now, this is not one of the scenes that really needs a sky, but I'm not really happy with just a plain blue sky. There's all this beautiful light coming in from the left, illuminating the tree bank. So we have some haze and we have some low clouds and fog. It would be nice just to have some wispy clouds in the sky. So it's not a total sky replacement per se. It's more just adding a portion of streaky clouds so that we can get a look that just doesn't look flat blue, adds a little bit more texture, a little bit more interest to the scene. This day in particular, there were no clouds, so I couldn't shoot any additional clouds. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a scene that we've looked at before, use a portion of it just for the sky. So this doesn't have to be perfect since we're just adding texture. It's not an exact science. It's not like when we did the sky replacement before where we had complex masking. We're going to do something really simple here to just get some texture out of the sky. Let's take a look at the file I've prepared for this. Go back to Capture One, and if you're in the Capture One catalog, you'll notice that next to this Lake Matheson image, I actually have the image from focus stacking. So what we're going to do is use this portion of the texture of the sky on the top of Lake Matheson, then we're going to reflect it as well. But before we do that, we're going to have to make some small edits to this to get it to match its destination, which is Lake Matheson. Notice the sky here, very blue, very pale, very easy, very soft. Sky here, a little bit more contrasty, a little bit more darker blue. So the first thing I want to do is try to match it a little bit, and I'm going to do that just by sort of recovering the shadows, and that's going to soften out that blue color. If I recover the highlights, you can see it's also going to dull out that white. So it's going to make just a slightly more dull image, which is perfectly fine because I want it to closely match this one. And to be honest, this is the only section we're really concerned about. You can also notice that I picked the one with the blurry foreground and the sharp background. This is from the focus stacking tutorial, if you guys remember that one. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one first. It's already in Photoshop, so since that one's already in Photoshop, this one looks pretty good. Now let's get this one into Photoshop as well. So I'm going to right-click again, Export Variants, Export One Variant. Oh, here we are in Photoshop. Let's do a Command-All for Select All, Copy. And we'll go ahead and close this file and paste it on top. So now we have this and this. So that doesn't look very good right now. So what are we going to do? Before, when we were at Skogafoss, we had very sharp edges on the top of the rock. Now, as you can see, we don't have that. We have a lot of light in the mountains. So what I did before, if you guys remember, I went up to Select, Color Range, and I tried to just select that sky. What happens if I try to do the same thing here? You can actually see that I'm not actually able to get the sky. Even if I turn the fuzziness up, you can see I can kind of get the sky, but you see all this banding? It's not looking that good. It looks like I'm going to end up with a lot of the background. So what we're going to do, instead of relying on this feature to get the channel that we want, we're going to see if we can get the right channel here in the color channels. So we've been using luminosity masks. We've created luminosity masks. We've talked about how the RGB channels are all individual luminosity masks that can be loaded as selections. So what we're going to do is create a custom channel selection based on a luminosity mask. So let's take a look at all three of these. Now let's say that I want the sky to be selected. So I'd pretty much want the sky to be completely white. I'd want the mountains to be completely black, so this is isolated and I can drop a new element in if it was a mask. Well, the red channel's not looking that good, the green channel's not looking that good, and the blue channel is looking better, but still I'm not going to be able to pull a perfect key for this sky. But that's okay. What I want to do is get it close enough. So I'm going to work first with the blue channel, and then we're going to clamp the levels. We're going to create a custom channel selection out of the blue channel. First thing I'll do is drag this blue down to the Make New Channel button, and that gives me a blue copy. Because if I change the blue channel, I'll edit the whole image. Now this is its own layer that I can make changes to. What I'm going to do is load a curves layer. The hotkey for curves is Command M. With curves selected, I'm going to go ahead and clamp these curves by moving the right pin to the left, which is going to raise the whites up a little bit. I want the sky to be completely white. And if I move the left one to the right, that's going to clamp the blacks. Now this is going to start to look pretty bad, and that's fine. Because what I'm actually trying to do is isolate the sky, and I want to select these areas around the trees. Some fall off, some white into the mountains is okay. I just want to make sure that I have the basis of a mask to start with, and I'm going to say okay to that. So that looks pretty good so far, and I'm going to show you why it looks good in a few minutes. But you notice by changing the curves globally, now take a look at the water. Notice how the water does not have that same white selection. So if I put this as a mask, you can see I'm going to start to lose it in these shades of gray. So what can we do here? Well, we can adjust the curves specifically for this area of the water. We can do that by drawing a marquee selection around the area that we want to manipulate, loading curves again. Command M curves. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull those whites out just so that I get more contrast here, a slightly more contrast in the blacks and the whites. And I'm just going to pull this up a little bit. There we go. Let's try something like that for now, and I'll say OK. Believe it or not, this is the basis of a channel selection, and it doesn't look good now, but let's see what we can do with it. What I'm going to do is go ahead and load this as a selection. I'm going to turn my channels back on, go to my layers, and I'm going to create a new folder. Whoops, not a mask, a new folder. Click on the Make New Mask button. Now this mask is going to be applied to this folder. I'm going to put this layer with the dock in the sky inside this folder, and I'm going to turn it on. So the first thing that you notice is that this looks horrible. This is not what I want at all. So let's go ahead and turn this off for a second. Let's take a look at it. We know that we only want to use the top part of the image, so the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the bottom part of the image that I don't want to use here. That's going to do two things. It's going to get rid of it so that I don't have to look at it, and it's also going to cut down space on the file size. By cutting that image in half, I actually save some file size there because I'm not using the image. Let's take a look at it one more time. Turn this mask back on. Oh, there we go. We're starting to get something. I'm going to go ahead and scale this layer a little bit, just with a Command T for transform. And basically what I want to do is just get it to be a little bit more of just this texture in the sky. So basically I want to have just this texture here. I'm going to scale it a little bit so that we have these wispy lines in the sky. It looks pretty good, just like that. I'm going to hit Enter, return on the keyboard there. And now, since this mask here on the outside, this channel mask here that looks bad, but it essentially selects most of the sky and the water, controls this layer, what I'm going to do is add another mask here so that I can get rid of this mountain area. So I'll go ahead and add a mask, and I'll select the gradient tool, and we go black to white. So I basically want it to disappear from about here to here. So now we get this sky texture just inside of that selection. If I want to adjust things right now, I can scale this still. I can still make adjustments until I find that exact amount of sky that I want. Another useful feature is I've created this mask I want this to live in, but let's say I wanted the mask to be a little bit different. Let's say that I wanted it to gradually fade a little bit more into black and white. Well, I'm still going to have a little bit of this mountain in the foreground, or now in my element because it was part of this mask. So what I can actually do, if I unlink this, the mask is now not linked to the layer, and if I transform the layer itself, you can see that I can move that independently from the mask. So what I can do is just start to scale this a little bit, and then I can get all the sky texture that I want and get rid of that mountain. So we'll go ahead and apply that. We'll relink this layer. Now right now it doesn't look so good. And remember that we ended up getting some of the selection of the mountain range here. Well, right now I'm using a normal mode. So I have a couple choices. I can either try to refine the masking, I can change the opacity, or I can audition different blending modes. So in this case, I'm going to use a different blending mode, and it should be a familiar one. I'm going to use overlay. So change normal here to overlay, and you can see now that I get texture in the sky, and any of the overlap here of that blue onto the mountain actually complements the mountain a little bit. In fact, if the sky had more blue and more texture in it like this, then that mountain would have more blue as well. So you can see if I turn this on and off, I'm able to overlap the mountain a little bit with a little bit of a less crucial need for complex masking. So it actually works in my favor here. And again, now I can go ahead and transform this layer a little bit, and I can decide if it's exactly how I want it to be, how much of that texture I want in there, and exactly where this distribution is. Now bear in mind, this isn't a 100% sky replacement. I'm not going to put, or try to put, an epic sunrise in here because it would pretty much be impossible, because with such a blue sky, I have all this light cascading through. But it would be believable to have a little bit of texture, some wispy clouds in the sky. And just by doing this simple trick, we've been able to add that. So we can refine this a little bit more later. Before we do that, we have to address the reflection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer. Command J on the keyboard will make a new layer, and I'm going to transform it. So Command T. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to transform it and I'm going to turn it upside down. So instead of 100%, I'm going to select 100% on the height, and I'm going to put a negative in front of it. And by putting a negative in front of it, that's going to turn it upside down. And if I move it down, or I move it into position, sorry, you can see that now, with that mask observed, the same mask that I've created, controlled on that folder, I can now move this into place to reflect that same texture in the water. And that looks pretty good. But here's the thing, it's a little intense. So at this point, for the water, I have a couple choices. I can either change the opacity, which is definitely an option, to mirror that water and mirror the opacity and the vibrance of the blue, or I can try a different blending mode. I can go back to normal, for example. And you can see that normal will actually, it's going to change the clouds, are going to influence the mountains a little bit, but again, it doesn't look too bad. And I can also change the opacity of this, just so the water has its own personality. So very quickly, with a channel mask and a sky from a scene that we really weren't going to use for any portfolio, it was just demonstration purposes for how to use focus stacking, I was able to use that sky and make something a little bit different out of this shot and add a little bit of texture. So now it just becomes that fine balance of the color and how I want it to look and any subtle masking that I want to change before I move on to the rest of the image. So let's say that we like the way this looks. We'll go ahead and close up this folder and move on to the next step. What I always find most interesting about post-processing, and remember back to the first few scenes that we did in Iceland, or the Londranger Cliffs, for example, where we really had to pull a lot of detail out of that image because it looks so flat. The post-processing itself didn't require any complex blending. It was just a little bit of Lightroom to get it to pop a little bit before we could bring it into Photoshop and apply Color Effects Pro to really bring out those variants in color and make a more immersive, dynamic scene. What's always interesting to me is I find the more complexity in the blending process, if we're adding skies, if we're doing multiple exposures, if we're doing different kinds of luminosity masks, or just regular mask blending, you'll notice that you've blended in so many parts of the best colors or the best elements that the external post-processing past that point ends up becoming much more simplified. And in a case like this scene is already so naturally beautiful and so naturally color-toned and light-toned to correctness that there's not going to be too much to do in post. Nevertheless, we should still go ahead and add some more color, vibrance, and detail while we're in Photoshop. The next step here would be just go ahead and keep everything layered here. What I always like to do is select everything that I have, my initial blend, put it into a folder, and you guys have seen me name this blend. Maybe not in all caps, so we'll just do blend. And once I have the blend selected, I can do that crazy hockey Shift, Option, Command, E. We'll make a new layer out of everything in my composition, put it on top, and allow us to use Filter, Nick, Color Effects Pro. Inside of Color Effects Pro, I'm going to start with the basics that I usually do. You guys remember the dynamic contrast is something we've been using on almost every scene, and it really adds exactly what it says, just beautiful dynamic contrast. I'm going to watch my histogram here, make sure that I don't break any boundaries. Correct color cast in this case is probably going to warm things up a little bit, which in this case I do like, a tiny little bit of that. I'm going to go ahead and correct the contrast just a hair to make up for some of the recovery that I did. And I'm going to add one more filter, and that's going to be contrast color range. So even though we used Capture One, which did a much better job with the contrast of the color, still requires a little bit of work on our end to really make those colors and contrasts pop. And I like very poppy, colorful, vibrant images. So I'll change the color contrast just a little bit, and you can see that's also manipulating the blue, which is pretty nice. I like the way that looks. We'll apply it. Subtlety is the key here. I don't want to go overboard on this because there's really no reason to. It's already naturally serene and beautiful. So right here, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. Click OK and wait for the result. With the Color Effects Pro result, let's just take a look at the before and the after. So it's subtle, but what it's done, using the contrast, the color range, we've brought this beautiful fog back. That is by far the brightest thing. It's being hit directly by the sun. It's very beautiful. We've illuminated this back wall of clouds. We've also added a little bit more color and contrast. And remember, when you color correct stuff, after you've done any kind of compositing, any kind of sky additions, any kind of exposure blending, by color correcting or using effects on top of that, helps to unify it all together. So think of everything put together with a global effect tends to marry it together and make it a little bit more seamless. So as long as your masking was good, the edges were good, when you start putting effects on top of things, then it has a way of bringing it all together and making it really nice. So from here, there's actually not too much left to do with the scene. I really actually quite like it. One thing that's bothering me, though, up in the corner, you notice that this kind of terminates, this black line of these trees kind of terminate the composition on the left. As a compositional element, I really like it, but what bothers me is these corners here where we can actually see the blue. So this is something I probably should have done earlier on, but what I'm going to do is use the rubber stamp tool, and I'm just going to press S on the keyboard, and I'm going to use a flow of about 30%. I'll select this down here, so this color, and I'm just going to kind of paint in some of these leaves back in here. I'm really not going to make a huge effort for it because we're essentially painting a solid color in that doesn't really matter so much. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint all that out. So this actually terminates on the edge and leads the eye into nothing rather than have it lead into little blue spots. I think that's a little distracting up there in the corner. So now it's basically just a compositional element, and it terminates basically on the left without too much detail. So I'm just going to take that away, and that'll help not pull the eye towards these areas where these weird details exist, and just leave it on the middle of the frame. So that looks pretty good. Now at this point, if we take a look at the histogram here and channels of RGB, if you like to see the colors, you can change it to colors, and then you'll see all the colors together. If that's distracting and you just want to see everything, just show RGB. And if you hit the exclamation point, it'll reset the curves and redistribute. Well, what I really want to point out here is on the right side of this curve, you can see that we're barely touching that edge, but we're not touching that edge. That's because there's still a lot of luminosity missing in the top portion. So basically, the highest point of luminosity exists inside of this fog layer, and then we have this big gap in this top quarter tone in the highlights. So what can we do to address that? Let's load a curves layer on an adjustment layer. Adjustment layer curves. And now we're going to see that same distribution. So what I can do, if I want to overall change the way this curve, redistribute this curve, stretch it back out so it reaches the entire edge, what I can do is just go ahead and slide this into the left, and you can see that's going to make the entire image brighter. If I do that too far, you can see the first thing to blow out, and blows out like crazy, here is those highlights. So what I can do is just do a simple curve adjustment, just so this basically means that this will touch pure white, because what I'm doing is clamping this curve in so that the edge of this graph basically meets the curve and then pushes it further towards the edge. So we can take a look at this too. Still nothing's blown out. We can go a little bit further here, just a little bit further. And what you can do with this selected is you can use the arrow keys. With the arrow keys, I can nudge it 1 point in this case. So 242, 243, and we can find that perfect example, the perfect median before we start blowing things out, just when this fog starts to touch white. So it's really just going to be that subtle game that we're going to play. And it may look subtle, but it's really how you distribute light in the scene. So it's creating a complete tonality from black to white. At this point, we can do a little color separation trick. Right now it's not quite autumn, really. It's peak summer, but you can see with that warm light we have a little bit of a golden tone on the side of the tree, dark green, light green, golden, and some browns here. So what we can do is we can create more exaggeration for this just by altering the colors. Remember, if I use something as simple as a photo filter and a photo warming filter, I can turn this up a little bit, preserving luminosity. I can black this out, and I can actually custom paint using the paintbrush at a very low flow. I can start to paint some of this back in. So let's say I want this to be warmer tones here. So warmer, I'll paint it into the reflection so it's warmer. Warm this whole area up right here. This is subtle too. So its subtlety is the key here, just to make it a little bit different than the standard. So if you want to add these warm tones in, I think it's better to add them in selective rather than globally here. So I'm just adding some warmth back into these trees, a little bit of warmth back in. We'll really exaggerate that orange-brown color. It's not fall foliage, but everybody loves the different colors of fall, so it's just a way to separate it. And if I turn this on and off, you can see it's subtle, but it's basically changed that green to a warm tone. And just to offset it a little bit, I can create a new photo filter, and I'm going to create a green filter. So we'll go ahead and set this to green. I'll turn it up a little bit, and I'll black this out as well. And remember, blacking things out, if you guys have forgotten, it's been a while since you've watched the last tutorial, you can always flood a mask with the foreground and background color. Flood with foreground is Option Delete, flood with background is Command Delete. So in this case, I hit Command Delete to flood to black. Select the paintbrush again, it's already there with a flow of 10, and I'm going to do the same thing now, but I'm going to work on the greens. So now, the edges of where I decided to paint warm, I'm now going to paint back with some green. So green everywhere here on the trees. Looks pretty good, tops of the fog. And how about back here? How about where that was a little bit warm before? We add some green to change some variation in the tonality of these trees. And basically adding a little bit of green here will make this look like it's a completely different type of plant and different type of tonality altogether. And if I added too much, I can just paint it out. If I want to add it back, I can just paint it right back in. Now again, this is more of an artistic process. This is something that I like to do just to create more color separation where there's flatness. Here we go, like this, for example, on the side of the hill is pretty nice. I can add a little bit of warmth here to the side of the hill, maybe a little bit of warmth to the side of the mountain, maybe a little warmth to this fog here, maybe a little warmth to counter the fog down here. Basically all selective, you can see from here to here. Doesn't make a whole lot of a difference as a whole, but if you look with a subtle eye, you can see that those colors shift and change a little bit. And it creates more of an artistic process, a way for us to change these colors and create more color separation. Color separation in this situation also adds a little bit more depth, so it gives us green to gold to green to gold rather than just one flat color. So it'll basically take us through the dimension, and two-dimensional space will end up looking a little bit more 3D. I know it's subtle, but it's a nice thing to be able to do. What I'll also address is the sharpness here. Capture One does a very good job with sharpening, but we may want to hit this up with a high-pass filter. So I'll duplicate this layer like I usually do, go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. We've been using a radius of 3, which has worked amazingly so far, so there's no reason to change it because we know it works perfectly at 36 megapixel. I'll go ahead and create a black mask for this by holding Option, clicking the Mask button, and I'm going to brush this in selectively with a 100% flow because I basically want these trees here to be basically be part of this high pass filter. And you can see right now I'm painting it on. Instead of using the quick mask, I'm just going to paint it on so that I can see the gray of where this is going to be applied before I change it to overlay. So it's just another way that you can do the same thing. If you want to use the quick mask mode, see the pink mask, you can do that, or you can just paint it in and then change it afterwards to overlay. And now it's only going to be sharpening those trees, and it's really going to, like a razor's edge, cut those trees out and pop them from the background. So again, if you want to add a little bit more in the mountain, I do this selectively with small percentages. So here's where you can really play with the high pass filter and chisel some edges while leaving some edges intact. For example, I do not want to chisel out these edges here. I want people to notice that this is a plant here, but I don't want to give it the center of attention. I really just want the sky, this tree line, not skyline, to be the center of attention here. And another thing too is what I did was I added it in the reflection, but it's not really going to make much changes to that in the reflection because there aren't really any hard edges. If you want to be a real big stickler for reflections, and something that I usually do is I omit any sharpness of the trees or anything that's in a reflection because I want that by nature to be soft. So in this case, I'll just go ahead and paint that out because I feel like it might not have been a good idea. Just in case it would pick up any of those edges, I want that reflection to definitely have a juxtaposed effect of a mirror against a solid object. So it's basically sharp on top, sharp in reality, and mirrored but soft in the water, and that's going to create that reflective separation that we're looking for. Now that everything's in place here, it's sharpened, we've had a good result here. What I'm going to do, just to complete this with all these files we've been using before and afters to promo each section of this, so we're going to go back to Capture One, we're going to bring this in so I can save this for you guys. I'll go back to the original file, and I'm just going to turn it all the way back down to the basic of how it started here. I'm going to export it one more time so that we can bring this in and look at the before and after to see how far we were able to push this. Export one more variant, put it right on the bottom. So what I want to show you guys here, we have the before image straight out of camera with Capture One. Already was looking really nice, and now check out the after, our final image. So we've added some texture to the sky, beautiful blue hues. We've added a little bit more blue to the mountain tips, which I think looks really nice. We have this beautiful mirrored reflection, all this incredible detail, and the mirrored sky as well. So I think that this scene went from already being very beautiful now to being more of a portfolio piece. We're able to have some more uniqueness, some texture, and basically intrigue throughout the image. And we did that all with a very simple and very easy to make channel mask. That basically wraps it up for Lake Matheson and Lesson 12. So I'll see you guys next time in the studio.